All right, our next topic and your first piece of homework for this week is studying Sooc, S-O-O-C, which stands for straight out of the camera or camera. And the rationale behind this is you want to get it perfect in camera if you can, because then you're going to be minimizing editing time. So if you're a photographer or sports photographer, someone doing big photo shoots where you have 750 images, and every one of them needs color correcting because you got something wrong, or they need a lot of balancing, cropping, leveling off. That's a lot of wasted time. So hopefully what I've been preaching to you all along is get it right in camera. Take lots of shots, try some different settings, experiment with it so that one of those shots is going to be the money shot in camera. No need to do anything. All right, so straight out of camera, if you're gonna think in these terms, like I don't even own Photoshop or Lightroom, I have to get it right in camera. So to do that, it requires a lot of practice, a lot of patience, and for many of us, a change of mindset, because a lot of us think, I can fix that later in Photoshop, no big deal. Well, it is a big deal when you're taking lots and lots of pictures. So 5 general tips to help you improve your straight out of camera shooting. Tip number 1 is to bracket your shots. If you haven't found this on your camera, I want you to look in your manual and find how you do exposure bracketing. And what that's going to do is whatever you set your aperture to. So if this is the shot they were going for, there's obviously a lot of blurred depth of field. So let's just say that their aperture was a 2.8. That required a certain shutter speed to let in this amount of light. But then what we're going to tell it to do is to just flex that by a little bit. So depending on what you have set up in your bracketing, is it going to be a full stop or just a third of a stop or 2/3 of a stop? So it will then keep your depth of field if you're in aperture priority mode, but it will slow down the shutter speed to let in more light, which is this version, or it will keep the 2.8 aperture and speed up the shutter speed. Even less light will get in and it will be darker. So you'll have these 3 shots to select from straight out of your camera. Bracketing is going to help ensure that you get a decent shot as far as exposure is concerned, and then there's some other things we can do with it. In Photoshop, we could load all of these shots on different layers, and then we can use masking to cover up and show certain areas, and we can kind of get an amazing combo. We could get, I think the exposure is perfect on the flowers in this one, but I love the exposure of the greenery in this one, and I love this dark background. So we could merge all 3 of these. If they're handheld and your bracketing is fast, they're probably going to be, exactly the same. If you have to put down your camera and spin some buttons to do bracketing, then there's no chance of you getting this exact same lineup of the subject matter. So using a tripod can be really helpful when you bracket. We can also use these different shots for HDR processing, which is high dynamic range, and we're going to cover that in a class or 2 ahead of us, which is very fun. The next tip to get something perfect out of camera is to shoot in that burst mode or continuous mode. If you have bracketing and this burst mode option, this is a great thing to pair up, because depending on your camera, on mine, I simply have to push the shutter once and hold it down, and it will fire off all 3 shots while I'm pushing down. So it gets the correct exposure, one darker, one lighter. On other cameras, you have to actually push the shutter 3 times, but because you're in this, well, if you're in burst mode, you just hold down the shutter once. So shooting in this burst mode is also going to help that at least one of these is the perfectly focused shot, or the one that captures the moment, or maybe you're lucky and a bunch of them perfectly capture the moment. Another advantage of shooting in that burst mode is you can combine shots into one image in Photoshop. So clearly this didn't happen in real life. This was a camera on a tripod Nothing about this scene changed or moved except for the location of the snowboarder. So by stacking all of these images on top of each other and masking out and only showing the snowboarder in certain areas, you can create a pretty cool shot. Tip 3 to get the perfect shot in camera without editing is to shoot in aperture priority mode. This is going to allow you to control the story, control the depth of field, what's in focus. Once you decide that, the camera is going to set up the correct exposure. So in this case, an f-stop of 2.0, which is a huge opening, very little coverage or blades. And as you can see, only a few things are in crisp focus here. It starts to get blurry quite quickly. Just a few stops away at 8.0, being this close to your subject matter, there's a lot more in focus. So the composition, what you want to be in focus is important, and the camera will balance out the shutter speed for you. Here's a great example of, frankly, some pretty ugly or not scenic picture up here. You know, got a couple of flowers and a lot of greenery. Aperture 22, everything's in focus. This one, they went all the way down, stopped down to a 2.8, which makes just a teeny tiny part of this in focus. Anything beyond this focal point or in front of it is blurred, and because of that, you can see just a few things are in focus. This bud right here, which you hardly notice over here, is actually at about the same focal plane, so that is fairly clear also. Down here, they chose different apertures, and they were at about 3 feet away at all times. The ISO stayed pretty constant except for it bumped up a little in this one. But at an f1.8, which is very little, the depth of field is very small. Only very little parts are in focus. The front of this statue, the bowl, is in focus, the back of it is not. So at an f1.8, that's a really big hole, it can shoot as fast as 1/500th of a second to get a proper exposure. If we stop down, which is going up to an f4, we have more blades, smaller hole, it needs more time open, 1/25th of a second, in order to get enough light in to get this. And you can see that we still have blur back here, but more of this is in focus. And then finally, if we go stop down all the way to an f8, which is a smaller aperture hole also, less light is getting in, so therefore it needs to be open, the shutter needs to be open, and then the digital sensor exposed for much longer, 1/40th of a second. And you can see how everything's in focus way back here. All right, tip number 4 is to take lots and lots of shots. If your goal is to get something perfect in camera and you take 10 shots and call it a night, I hope you were really good and or really lucky. So the more you take, the better you're going to have that perfect shot. The more you test different scenes, like you can capture some pretty cool faces, or you get these duds where they're running out of the screen. You can also test letting more or less light in if the person is sitting stationary and you're not worried about it changing. Bracketing, things like that. Lots and lots of shots are going to eventually yield something perfect in camera. And then tip number 5 is to really take your time when you're out shooting. If you're shooting a landscape, I'm looking at this shot. Do you notice how the horizon line is tipped here? The lake is tipped. It's better in this one, better down here. That's something that we do a lot without realizing it. So I would encourage you, if you haven't already, look back at any photo you've ever taken where the horizon line is obvious, especially if there's a lake. It's almost always not straight. So check your horizon line in camera. Make sure that it's level. You are not fixing anything later. These shots are perfect coming out of camera. Check the depth of field. Are you telling the story that you want to tell? Is there a lot that's blurry with just a few things in focus, or do you want everything crystal clear? Check for balance. Where's your subject matter? Does it look awkward because there's too much sky and it's not pretty? Things like that. Check for the rule of thirds. We talked about putting your subject matter in one of those 4 intersection points. If you can picture a tic-tac-toe grid overlaid on your camera, The rule of thirds is a really strong way to compose your photos, or intentionally break this rule. And I have to say intentionally because bad composition, you can't just say, oh, I was trying to break the rule. You can usually tell when people aren't trying to break the rule. It's just not a good shot. Slow down, have patience, walk around, capture the moment. So I have a couple of examples for you of Sooc. So if you're ever online looking at imagery and you see Sooc written on something like this is at a photography website and you never knew what it was, it is straight out of camera. So here's her Sooc and here's her final edit. And you might be saying, well, they look the same. She didn't do any great editing. Well, that's the point. Awesome work was done straight in the camera. Minimal editing was needed to get this final product. So if you look at these, and depending, how this video is coming through and what your monitor is like, really the only difference I see is that this shot is a little bit warmer, especially in her skin tones. She's a little bit lighter and a little bit warmer, more yellow in this shot, but that is about it. This is what I'm looking for. Straight out of camera, you took this shot. Fantastic. I don't want it to be one of those things where before and after you show a horribly exposed shot and then you work your Photoshop magic and say, look at how great this one is. Well, that's great if that's the only option you have and you're a Photoshop wizard, but as a photographer, getting it right in camera is the name of the game. So here's another one. Here's the Sooc shot. Here's the final. What's different? Very, very little. If you're reading the words I have on here, there's a foot. The photographer's directly over her shooting the baby, shooting straight down. This foot was edited out and it was cropped a little bit tighter at the top. That's really about it. This is pretty dynamite right in camera. And then finally, this is Sooc, this is edited. Again, think about the rules of portrait photography. When we keep the eyes up in this upper third quadrant, it's a stronger picture. So this one was decent, but there is a lot of editing to it. They zoomed in, they brightened it up, but there's a lot good about it too. This picture, as far as composition, cropping didn't change. So the Sooc is over here on the right. You can see it down here. Probably a little bit of lightening in levels or curves, and that's about it. But again, we're looking for hardly any difference between the two. When you submit yours, which is your homework, I want them to be awesome. I want them to be this good straight out of camera, or this good straight out of camera. So your homework due next week is a Sooc assignment. I want you to take lots and lots of photos, any subjects, people, landscape, pets, still life, sports, whatever. Current photos. I know we're in a weird situation where we're not encouraged to, be hanging out in groups. But the cool thing about photography is this is really something that is best, frankly, on your own, exploring and going out on your own. So if you have the ability to get out of your house, walk around your block, walk around your yard, drive somewhere, even if you're in one of the cities around here, you only have to drive 10 minutes and you're out in a pretty rural setting and might see some pretty cool things. I want you to really get into this and play with your camera. The goal is that you learn your camera and that you learn photography composition. So take lots and then choose the best 2 straight out of camera shots. So you're going to be uploading your best 2 right here. Best 2. They are straight out of camera. They do not need cropping, color correcting, etc. I'm going to have you upload the 2 unedited images, so no touching up, no recropping. All I want you to do, like you've been doing so far, is open the file straight out of your camera, and it's probably going to be 12 to 24 megs, huge, and I want you to resize it down to that 15-inch maximum width or height at 72 dpi. That's going to take it from a huge file down to a 1 to 2 meg file. So you're going to give me those 2 images and then a document where you include the photo caption, when and where taken, what composition principles you use, what you actually were thinking about, leading lines, rule of thirds, eyes at the top third, off-centered subject, really blurring the background, whatever. And you're also going to tell me how you set up your camera and why. Because I knew I wanted a lot of blur, I knew I had to be in aperture priority mode and go with the lowest f-stop my camera would give me with the given lighting that day. I was able to get down to a 4.5. I put the fire hydrant in the lower third grid and off-centered it and blurred out the background and tried to tell a story of just focusing on the fire hydrant, things like that. So that is your Sooc assignment. Again, keep track of these original files because next week we're going to start doing some editing, and I may have you come back to some of these and tweak them, although quite frankly this one will not be used. The goal is to get this perfect in camera. But your landscapes that you turned in 2 weeks ago, your portraits that you just turned in, those are some files that we will likely go back to once we get to the photo editing part. All right, that's that. Let me know if you have any questions.